So in the last video, I kind of made this point that this idea of nation, this idea of like a shared kind of universal culture, custom language within a nation really isn't accurate, and that's something that needs to be constructed through discourse and also through force. And that is usually comes from the state. And this is really kind of Curtin's starting point in her kind of discussion of language and identity in the United States and Taiwan. And she starts off with this idea of differential belonging, right? Where one group is granted a legitimized presence while another group is granted a delegitimized presence. And she's applying this concept to language, that any place has like kind of a linguistic landscape. So the varying languages and linguistic practices that exist within a space is called a linguistic landscape. And you can think of that as a country, as a city, a neighborhood, a college campus. Your kind of unit analysis can change, but that's really what linguistic landscapes means. And what Curtin is kind of starting off with is this idea that the linguistic landscape isn't neutral, that all languages that exist within a linguistic landscape aren't necessarily treated equally, but are granted sort of differential levels of belonging. And she calls that a linguistic hierarchy, where some languages are granted a legitimate presence, while others are granted a delegitimized presence. And she talks about, for example, like the histories of, language in the United States and American Indian boarding schools and forcing Native American children to adopt English by taking them away from their families and putting them in these kind of abusive, well, not kind of, very abusive boarding schools. And all of that is kind of a process of the racialization of language. So assigning racial characteristics to language as a way to maintain systems of structural oppression. And she starts off with these histories as a way to make the point that language is not neutral. It's not just a system of words, right? But there's a lot of kind of social meaning that gets put onto these systems of words. And we're going to explore that a little bit more through the concept of social indexicality and mock Spanish. And I am going to be focusing on that part of her reading more in this lecture, just because I found that that's the part that students struggle with the most. So I want to give a little bit more context to it. An indexicality in general, it comes from semiotics, and it's this idea that a sign points to or indexes. So index and indexicality is like referencing the index finger, like our pointer finger. So that a sign points to some object in the context in which it occurs. So sometimes in linguistics, you'll hear someone say that like this word indexes this thing. You can translate index as points to. Like imagine someone pointing at something with their index finger. And so words and expressions in language derive some of their meaning from indexicality. So for example, if someone says the word I, they are indexing the person speaking. So when I say I'm kind of indexing myself because I'm kind of drawing attention to me, the speaker. And here, the word here indexes a location in which the word is being spoken. So when someone says here, they're indexing wherever it is they are. So if you're talking to someone and they say, I'm here on campus, here is indexing campus. And so all of our language does that. All of our words do that. And words and expressions, though, can also index a social meaning. One word can contain a lot of meaning and produce and reproduce differential belonging, but can also challenge differential belonging. So when we're talking about indexicality, you can think of a word or expression as a signifier, and what the word or expression indexes as it's signified. And this is that starting point for Curtin's discussion of social indexicality. So social indexicality, as she said, is the use of language to point to or index certain social identities and qualities. Right? So very similar to discourse, right? So how one word can signify meaning around not just a meaning of a place, but meanings around social groups. And so social indexicality then really kind of signifies differential belonging, and it's reflective of existing social hierarchies. And it can be used either to reproduce and reinforce those hierarchies or to challenge and contest them. So for example, agent group members might use language as a way to reinforce systems of oppression. She gave you kind of a lot of examples of that throughout the reading, such as, residents of that New England town being upset by having Spanish language signage in the area, but being okay with French language. But it can also come from target groups, right? So using language as a way to call attention to challenge, to contest, to subvert systems of oppression. The Me Too movement is a really kind of good current example of that. That hashtag Me Too is indexes violence against women, but not just indexing or pointing to violence against women, but a call to do something about violence against women. It's trying to kind of challenge that system of oppression. And that's what social indexicality is looking at, the ways in which language gets produced to create a meaning about the social world. And two things that she kind of gets into in this reading that I want to kind of give a little more detail on are these ideas of dual indexicality and mock Spanish. They're really important because it really kind of helps us understand the problematic ways in which language can be used, but they're also really difficult to understand. So I want to break them down just a little bit more. And so mock Spanish comes from a woman named Jane Hill, who published this work in 1995. And is calling attention to the ways in which language, in particular language of target group members, can be used to sort of reinforce oppression. And so mock Spanish is when non-Spanish speakers take elements of Spanish language and typically elements that have a positive or neutral meaning and give them a negative connotation. And we do this with Spanish, we do this with African American vernacular English, with other languages, but we're going to focus on Spanish here as one example. And when people do this, right, when a non-Spanish speaker does this, they're enacting kind of two practices. One is direct indexicality, which means that they're assigning a positive connotation to themselves. So the person using mock Spanish, they get to call themselves humorous, or they get to be seen as like kind of cultured, and intelligent, they can play with words. But they're also invoking an indirect indexicality, right, which they're kind of assigning a negative connotation onto native Spanish speakers. And mock Spanish is part of a racial project. It reproduces and normalizes structural racism. And that's because mock Spanish, and really any form of mock language, is only effective if there's an existing negative stereotype of that group. It doesn't create stereotypes, but it draws on ones that already exist to try to put the user of a mock language in a positive light. So there really is no way to do it if negative stereotypes don't exist. If you tried to use mock Spanish, for example, with someone who doesn't have a lot of ideas of stereotypes around like Latino people, your joke would land flat. Like they wouldn't get it. It wouldn't be effective. And so because of that, one point that I want to make here, that I need you to keep in mind as we kind of continue with this, is impact over intent. A lot of students, when they learn this concept of mock Spanish for the first time, there's a tendency to kind of think of it as, well, it was their intention to be humorous, so it's not a big deal. It's really important when we're talking about things like this to remember that impact is more important than intent. So we need to focus on what the outcome is onto the people who are negatively impacted by it, rather than what the intentions of the speaker are. You may have heard that phrase, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. That's because just because your intentions might be good or neutral or whatever, doesn't mean that you haven't caused harm. And so we need to be really mindful of how these things can cause harm. The first strategy, there's kind of four that mock Spanish can take. And the first one is the one that Curtin talked about in your book, and that was semantic pejoration. And semantic pejoration is when you take negative or neutral Spanish words and phrases and give them negative connotations. And she gave you the example from the Terminator films, where John Connor and the Terminator are, having a conversation, and John Connor starts using all of these kind of Spanish phrases as a way to kind of make himself look humorous, right? So he uses like no problemo, right? Or hasta la vista, baby. And that became, some of y'all might be too young to remember this, that became a really popular phrase. Like, it was just all over the place. It got referenced in pop culture just like all the time. It really kind of took off, especially when Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Terminator, started using it himself. And so really it's like, it kind of takes these Spanish phrases and in a way kind of mocks them, right? Because you're taking it from a people who are have all of these kind of existing stereotypes around them, and then you're taking it and you're kind of twisting it into something else. And so it's direct indexicality because John Connor and the Terminator get to look humorous, right? But it's indirect indexicality in the sense that it's drawing on these negative stereotypes of Mexican people in order to use it. Right. And so there are three more, and for sake of time to kind of keep these in short bites, I'm gonna move on to the third video for this. Sorry, there's gonna be more videos than normal because got to give you a 50-minute lecture online, but be kind of thinking about that, right? And be thinking about how utilizing these kind of common phrases, what the impact of that is on the people who are on the native speakers of that language. All right, and be thinking about that as we move on to the next video, where we'll go over the next three forms of mock Spanish.